Come on. Good morning. Finally. I think we're trying to relearn how to behave like human beings after such an absence of in-person experiences. So my name is Andrew Howard, and I'm the president and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance, which is Greater Portland's Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us today for our February forum focused on our region's state of the economy. It is so incredible to be gathered here in person again. For those of you here with us, thank you for braving, they say cold temperatures. I'm from Wisconsin, it's really not that cold, I just gotta be honest. It's ridiculous. It's actually kind of balmy. An early morning hour. We're happy you joined us. And also, for you in that camera, wherever you are, anywhere on planet Earth, including my mom and dad, I think you're in Florida, they're watching live. Thank you for joining us this morning. A recording of this presentation and links for resource mentioned will be available on the website later today, so check in to make sure to see those important critical updates. And please make sure to follow us on our social channels. Look at that. That's where we're at. Please, for the latest updates on our work, and you can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, wherever the internet is. Of course, none of these events, and especially this particular report that we are featuring today, would be possible without the support of our members. And I also want to acknowledge and, of course, thank our board chairs in the house here. Everyone give a little bit of love to John Tapogna. We'll start with our welcoming and mentioning our incredible sponsors that have helped to make this event possible. First, a warm and generous thanks goes out to our State of the Economy presenting sponsor, Bank of America. Let's give Bank of America a huge round. For our series sponsor that's been with us month in and month out, the Portland Tribune. I'm supposed to do something. I will not touch it. Always listen to the person that knows technology. Our appreciation goes out to our event sponsors. Greater Portland Inc., you're in the house. Where are you? There we are. Hello, Greater Portland Inc. And ECONorthwest, our state of the economy partner for 12 years and counting. Let's give Echo a huge round of applause. Welcome up our guests from these sponsors. Let me start with the Tribune. Dana Haynes is in the house. Dana, come on up.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate being here. It's been said before, and it probably is worth saying again, that this is the damnedest economy any of us have ever seen. When the pandemic hit, we watched the economy do its impression of an anvil and a coyote. But was it a recession? Because there was no debt, there was no bubble. Inequities that existed before the pandemic got worse. And then all of a sudden, boom times seemed to come back. And everything seemed to get better, but the inequities are still there. The state of Oregon, you take the general fund plus the lottery, is up $1.7 billion from the end of the last session. But $1.2 billion of that is just up since November. But show of hands, how many of your coworkers and families feel like they're living in boom times? Do you? We have a few. All right. We're going to hear today some of the reasons behind this baffling economy. And with luck at all, we'll see where it might be taking us. Because I think I speak for everybody in the room saying, we really don't know. For Mark Garber, president and publisher of the Portland Tribune and the Tampa Media Group, we're honored to be here and part of this conversation. We thank you very much.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Mark, wherever you are in the virtual world. And of course, the support is appreciated year in and year out. And as we go through this year's State of the Economy report, I'm sure all of you will have questions. Yes, you in a virtual space and you here in the audience. If time allows, we'll have a great opportunity for questions and answers. For those of you joining via Zoom, that's you. Yes, you in a virtual territory. Please share your questions with us by using the question and answer tool at the bottom of your Zoom window. For those of you in person, you cannot hide yourself behind your camera or unmute yourself. You're actually in person, so you actually have to raise your hand, old-fashioned style. Please make sure to include your name, your organization, location of your business when you're submitting your questions online. And before I just introduce Art Avitio with Bank of America, I just want to a little bit of a note about what a remarkable year this has been. 2 weeks ago, we released our annual polling conducted by DHM. Unless you were living under a rock, you saw the coverage of this, of course, the results, the implications of the way that Portlanders are feeling. And then when you pair it with the data that's contained within this report, the economic information, the demographic trends that we're seeing, we expressed the evaluation of this in a word that I feel is so appropriate, crossroads. And I think it's important because no, we are not Detroit. No, we are not New York City in the 70s and 80s. And any comparison should be utterly rejected. But we're at a tough spot right now. And if you are feeling like I am, and any one of you as employers, that these are challenging times to navigate as a business community, you're not alone. And we have a lot of work ahead of us. But the good news is the alignment on what the priorities are, economically speaking, as a community, have never been more crystal clear. We have an unbelievable challenge with the unsheltered homeless population in our region. We do. We have a criminal condition in our region we've never faced before. It needs to get better. We have to work together to make it better. And for this economy to thrive, these issues have to be addressed. And not yesterday, but now. So let's work together and make sure that we turn this ship around in a big way. And I know we can do it. And with that, it takes partnership, and partnership like Bank of America, and of course, Arch, who's on our board, who serves in the capacity of chair of membership and events. I think it's absolutely appropriate that he's here today representing Bank of America. So with that, please join us on the stage, Art, and give him a big round of applause.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many familiar faces after nearly 2 years. I think this is our second live and digital event in the last couple of years. So thank you to PBA for bringing this all together. Thank you to the events team. I would be remiss if I didn't shout them out for getting us together here in person and virtually for such an important discussion. Bank of America is committed to sponsoring this study as we believe it is important to have an understanding of where our economy is headed and what our path forward is for our region. At Bank of America, we're focused on supporting our local economy and our community. These past 2 years, we have looked to support our clients with innovative solutions for unique issues that arose during the pandemic. We have significantly increased our already generous employee benefits, including financial support for child and elder care, and increasing access to mental health services. We also invested over $4 million in Oregon and Southwest Washington over the past 2 years to address economic mobility disparities and barriers. I know many other businesses, as Andrew mentioned, have focused on supporting our community and local economy. So big shout out to all the businesses here. But it's no secret that Portland economy has taken a hit over the last couple of years. One of the country's most dynamic cities and markets has been enduring the effects of the pandemic, rising crime and homelessness, labor and housing shortages, and a growing tax burden. Today, we're joined by John Tapogna, Senior Policy Advisor with ECONorthwest. John is here to help us unpack the latest economic data and trends. With that, I'd like to invite John up to the stage.
All right, well, I was thinking it might be nice to have one of those last time at the in-person breakfast forum pieces. And my last in-person breakfast forum was in early 2020, and I got up and gave a presentation like this one. And we were talking about the longest expansion in U.S. history, and that there was really nothing fundamentally wrong with the economy, and there was about only a 1 in 4 chance of a recession. So you can see what my track record is, and take that into account as you think about any forward-looking proclamations that I take today. Thank you. This has been a wonderful partnership with Portland Business Alliance, dating back 12 years. It is one of our favorite projects at the company because not only it just gives us an opportunity to take a deep dive and really understand the community that so many at ECONorthwest live in. So a pleasure to do this work. So let's get into it. let's start with the most hopeful news in this slide, and this is the cumulative COVID death rates per 100,000 for Portland and its peer cities. And this region throughout this pandemic has overperformed or performed well in a relative sense on the public health front. Last year, we put out a number of roughly 2,500 people whose lives were saved because our death rates were lower than the U.S. average. If we were to update that number, that's 3,400 people in this region because of these lower death rates. It is a combination of government regulation and public health orders and that kind of thing, but I'd say probably even more so, just the collective action of people who live in this region, and we're looking out for one another and looking out for themselves at the same time. So that, I think, is something that should be celebrated. And I think, frankly, should be something that we should figure out how to tell an economic development story around. This is a region that generally is collectively active and believes in science. And I think that's a good selling point for households and businesses that want to locate here. So I'll start with that glass half full comment, because we're going to get into some more challenging charts as we move along. This is also we talked about the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. We also just experienced the shortest recession in U.S. history. It was about a little over a month, thanks in no small part due to just unprecedented federal fiscal and monetary support, nothing like we have seen in the New Deal or in the Great Recession. That, together with the fact that major parts of our economy and industries were able to figure out how to continue functioning while being socially distant from one another. So if I just think of my own firm, we didn't have continuity of operation plans that were highly detailed of how to switch instantaneously to remote work. But somehow it happened. And if you go back and look at our own firm's financials, you would have a hard time seeing a pandemic in them. We kept doing our work. We figured out how to interact with one another. Folks stepped up. See a lot of office activity at 11 o'clock at night, 5 o'clock in the morning, et cetera. But people stepped up and did it. They did it in many different parts of the economy, and especially in the healthcare sector, which deserves a special call out. Josh Lerner, I'll give credit to him. He, I think, coined the term the square root economy when we're trying to find letters, V's or L's or U's, et cetera. This has sort of become a bit of a square root economy where we've got a deep sort of 15% or so reduction in employment right out of the gate, and then a sharp rebound as we opened up in May, June of 2020, and then sort of a gradual recovery after that. Compare that to, at this point in the Great Recession, we still hadn't found the bottom yet. This many months out, we were still trying to find that trough. And it took us an awfully long time to dig out of that. So that's a big difference this time around. In terms of where the losses have been sustained, the light bars here, this is for the Portland region. The light bar sort of takes you out to the maximum loss, and the darker bar is showing you where either the loss or the gain is as of more recent times. November of 2021. And so you can see that big loss, 50% reduction in leisure and hospitality. And then that second category, auto repair, beauty salons, pet care, et cetera, a lot of sort of in-person services, those kinds of things. Education and health services, a fair bit of that is sort of private education. That took big hits. And then, varying, you can see sort of losses down in the professional business services and the retail trades that were deep, but now have fully recovered their employment relative to the pre-pandemic levels. The story for the region is a relatively easy one to tell. For me, it makes sense when you sort of think about what's been going on in this region. So this first one is sort of showing you where the losses have been or where the job recovery is within the region. And so the slowest recovery from a jobs perspective in the city of Portland, followed closely by Multnomah County, that includes the city, and that Clackamas and Washington. And that differential story, I think, is told by the fact that you do have much more of the tourism industry in the center of the city, much more leisure and hospitality activity going on in the center of the city, and that's what's slower to recover. And then, if we compare to our peers, you can see, again, the slowest job recovery of any of our peers: Indianapolis, Seattle, Nashville, Salt Lake City, Boston. And there, I would sort of go back again. I want to go back to those COVID-19 charts. Some of this has had to do with sort of our collective response and consumer behavior relative to this pandemic. If you go to open table data, we don't go out to eat as much, even if the governor allowed us to go out to eat or the mayor allowed us to go out to eat. We aren't doing it as much, so we're behaving differently. And consequently, that leisure and hospitality sector is slower to return than it is in places like Austin, Salt Lake City, Nashville. And there you have it. There's the story for the leisure and hospitality sector, still down almost 20% in terms of employment in November of 21 relative to pre-pandemic. The other place that you're going to see disproportionate impacts in the Portland metro area is in the transportation equipment and sort of the adjacent metals manufacturing sectors. And that ties into largely aircraft supply chain work that, again, has a pandemic story associated with it. So that travel and tourism industry sort of slowed down production and orders for planes up in Seattle, mainly, and all those suppliers down here took the hit. And so if you're to tell the two stories of Portland in terms of disproportionate impact, it's the leisure and hospitality sector, which is hit more severely here than other places because of our regulatory response and because of consumer behavior, and then this transportation equipment sector in manufacturing. Now, we're going to turn to the issue of downtown. And we came out with some findings last year where we were, trying to understand. We do understand that downtowns everywhere across the United States are struggling. The phenomenon of remote work is affecting every downtown across the United States to some degree. The great piece this week in the Washington Post where they compared downtown's challenges to a patient who suffered a heart attack, and that the heart is damaged and it will remain damaged. And like a heart patient, you have to be thinking about that recovery from the moment you wake up in the morning until the time you go to bed. You have to be thinking about your diet. You have to be thinking about your exercise. You have to be thinking about all the different parts of your heart that are damaged and this downtown. So the question that we really had and didn't have a good answer to is to what extent is Portland's downtown challenged any more severely than other downtowns. And last year, if we could just get Uber or Lyft or somebody to give us some intercity comparisons, that would be helpful, but it didn't have it. So, but this year we have come across a way to get at that. Echo bought a subscription to data from an organization called Placer AI. And Placer AI aggregates data from your phones. I know you're turning it off as much as you can, but I'm telling you, you're not turning it off all the time. And so we bought a subscription that allows us to sort of draw boundaries on maps and say, let's take a look at what the activity looks like within those boundaries. You could do it at a building level, you could do it at a sort of a neighborhood level, you could do it at a downtown level, et cetera. The other piece that this outfit does, and they do, they do their due diligence to make sure that their answers are directionally correct. I wouldn't trust them to the percentage point, but I think in terms of is a place suffering more than another place, it gets it right at that level. Is that they have, they go through the data and they can start to sort out, oh, this is an individual who just comes into this jurisdiction every now and then. I'm going to call them a visitor. Here's somebody that I've seen sort of go to the same place multiple times. I'm going to call them an employee. So they have, I'm sure all kinds of analysts that are going through that and figuring that out. So what we did here is take those data and look back to January of 2020 and benchmark that downtown Seattle to downtown Portland for visitors. And you see that, very sharp decline in March of 2020, sort of these gradual recoveries, but the recovery for Portland just not on the pace that you're getting that recovery in Seattle. Both challenged for sure, but Portland down sort of 8 percentage points or so all along. Right? So something that we need to be paying attention to. If you do it on the employee side, declines even sharper. And I think these are in line with other data that you're getting out of card swipe and card block studies that just show, obviously with Omicron and other things, people haven't come back to the offices yet. Again, downtown Portland more challenged than Seattle. These take time to sort of learn and analyze, et cetera, but we do have the ability to start looking at this Portland, Indianapolis, to Nashville, all those places, and parts of downtown relative to other parts of downtown. So there's an awful lot to learn here. It's our hope that potentially with work with the city and others, we can start to further unpack this story of which parts of this heart are recovering and which parts aren't. The downtown office vacancy tells a similar story, and I'll apologize here because I've got I've got two things going on here at once. I've got a vacancy rate, which is shown by the bars, and then I've got the increase in the vacancy rate, which is shown in the numbers that are sitting on top of the red line. So just pause here for a second to absorb that. We've got about a vacancy rate a little bit north of 18%. In 2021 year to date, when we pulled those data out of CoStar, that's a 25% increase from 2020. So you can see, while we didn't have the largest increase in office vacancy, Seattle gets that prize. We do have the highest rate of office vacancy of our peers. So yet another sort of story that's echoing the challenge of downtown. And then this is a piece that we introduced in last year's report. Urban Land Institute does a survey of real estate investors, bankers, and others nationally who would be the people who would come into a region. This is more of a regional benchmark than a downtown, and basically asks them, what do you think of this region as a place to go invest in real estate? Back in 2017, we were the darlings. This is 100% means out of 88 cities. We were number 3 in the country on their ranking. Last year, we reported that we had fallen to 66th or 67th. So that gets you down to the bottom. We've got a bump back up, but clearly a long ways from the go-go days in Portlandia in 2017. When I talked to my colleague, Mike Wilkerson, he thinks this is moving in the right direction, and that when we come back here next year and get the survey again, that we'll continue to make some gains just from his ear to the ground. Again, a regional indicator more than a downtown per se. And there, just for comparison, is where Seattle and Boise are on this ULI indicator for the 2 most recent years. So now we're going to pivot. Another opportunity we had with this report was to sort of step back. We had findings come out of the decennial census of 2020. And so it gave us an opportunity to sort of step back and look at a decade of population growth. I'll sort of tee this up by saying we need to be thinking about population and demographics differently than we have in the past. I think most Oregonians and Portlanders probably have something in their minds from the late 90s where there were just so many people coming here and we couldn't keep up with roads and we couldn't, livability seemed to be challenged, et cetera, because we had not only sort of a relatively fast growing US population and an awful lot of migration into the region. We are entering and have already entered an era of very slow US demographic growth. In Oregon, our natural rate of population growth has gone negative for the first time in modern history, where there were more deaths. Some of that, that COVID accelerated that timeline a little bit. But all it did was bring it up. It was going to happen. More deaths than births for people who are residents of the state of Oregon. So that means your natural increase for a state is negative. Step back and think to Tom McCall, visit but don't stay. If people literally took that visit but don't stay with negative population growth, you have a slowly declining, stagnating state with no dynamic activity going on. So that is those are the demographic trends that are with us for the next 20 years. And this mindset of this region and the state needs to shift. This is not Tom McCall's Oregon from a demographic position anymore. And it has a big economic story associated with it. So here's what population growth looked like over the course of the last decade, the blue being the net migration, the red being the natural increase, and this is for the 4-county area. So you can see the big run up 2014 through 2016, decent to 17, and then starting to taper off there. So there you have that. If we sort of take a look at it by county, it's just interesting to unpack that. See, Clackamas County is telling that story that looks more like the state as a whole, virtually no natural increase in population, and now is becoming almost entirely dependent on migration to grow at all. And then if I go to Multnomah County, it had some good run up in the middle part of the last decade that sort of collapsed and now is only working on natural increases. Washington County, basically the same story. And the region's growth in recent 4 years has been on the Washington side of the border with net migration and a good natural increase as well. I would just say, generally speaking, people vote with their feet, and they're voting a little bit more for Clark County than they are for Troy County, Oregon at this point. We also were able to take a look at race and ethnic changes over the course of the decade. And so again, I've got two things going on in this chart. I've got the levels with the bars of the share of the population who are BIPOC. And then the number sitting on top of the orangish bar is the percentage increase from 2010 to 2020. So what you can say here is that Portland had a sizable increase, 32% increase, and we happen to sort of land at about 30% population who are non-white. That ties us with Seattle and outpaced many of our peers. But again, a relatively low rate because we're starting at such a low base to begin with. And history, our history here of exclusion casts a long shadow, and it will take quite some time to undo that, and it will take an awful lot longer if our net migration numbers stay as low as they have been on the Oregon side of the border. Now, just a couple of pieces. I think it was back in 2015, PBA was one of the first organizations that rang the bell on the housing affordability and production challenges in the region. Again, our organization, ECONorthwest, will argue till the end that a legacy of underproduction relative to the number of jobs and the number of households that have been created is at the heart of the affordability challenge, and is also the principal driver of our challenge with homelessness. And so if you go to DHM's polls, their issues of housing affordability and homelessness are at the top of the list, and put those together, you don't have much of a challenge to that. So we will continue to pay attention to this. Here you've got sort of trends on the units under construction, both for the city of Portland and for the 4-county metro region. Had a nice run up in 2018, but have now fallen off. And that's just a cycle that we've got to be paying attention to and not let fall as far as this has. Big piece of legislation being developed now for the 2023 session that would take housing needs projections that have been developed through House Bill 2003 and somehow try to turn them into housing production goals, perhaps binding housing production goals for localities. Keep a close eye on that, because as that bill gets developed, it has a lot of potential to really sort of put some appropriate pressure on localities to really think through all of the various barriers to production that are out there, and get their focus on making sure we don't have this sort of boom bust in production. That again, unfortunately, this reduction that we have here is going to manifest itself in increased rents over the course of the next year. Now, a little bit of good news here is that in the city of Portland, you are seeing permits coming back. And so forward looking, we should expect my colleague Mike, who knows this stuff much better than I do and spends all day thinking about it, thinks that that previous chart probably is at the trough, and that we are going to see construction pick up again. It's unfortunate we have to go through a trough, but things are moving in the right direction, and we really need to put everything we can behind that and keep it moving in the right direction. Segue to cost of living. Right before the pandemic, DHM was running polls, and there we were, sort of at the end of a long U.S. economic expansion, and yet DHM was going out and asking people how they felt about the economy, and it didn't sound like they were in the longest U.S. economic expansion. And it was easy to understand why. Wages were increasing, unemployment was low, labor force participation rate was high. It seemed like all those top line indicators were moving in the right direction. And yet you would ask people what it felt like to live here. And they'd say, wow, it's hard. It's hard to make ends meet. PBA, going back probably to the very first report, was always good about taking a look not only at the median household income, but also let's adjust it for the cost of living here. And in Portland would typically, compared to peers, be in the middle, maybe on the unadjusted median household income, but would fall to next to the last when it came to median household income adjusted for the cost of living. We continue to find that, but we've now gone a little bit deeper. This is work from the Massachusetts Institute technology, MIT, which maintains a living wage calculator. You can go on their website and play around with it. And essentially, the way these work is they attempt to say, what would it take for a family of a certain characteristic, in this case, 2 adults and 2 kids, to be able to afford to live in a place without sort of major federal or state subsidy. So they're not going to be on food stamps, they're not going to be getting a child care subsidy, they're not going to be getting a housing subsidy, et cetera. What would that take? And so you can see in this case, as you sort of add up all the sort of the main expenses here, that Portland comes in second, only to Seattle, and then you sort of move down the list from there, with housing being a main driver there, along with taxes. And in this particular chart, the way that MIT does it, the taxes show up in a couple of different places. The one that's labeled taxes is state taxes predominantly. And the one, the property taxes show up in the rent. So that's sort of, you have a bit of a combination there. But in any event, this is just providing more detail along that high cost of living drumbeat that we've been beating for a decade or so. Then if we look at Washington, D.C. Steps through and looks at taxes for households of various income levels, it doesn't sync up perfectly with MIT, but it just gives you a flavor here to be able to break out the different components of this. So we chose sort of a household at $75,000 of family income, and there the taxes are second to Indianapolis, with that first bar being income tax. That it is, and I think Oregon has sort of long been, I think, criticized by some for just how quickly the income tax is assessed at the low end, and then how quickly you get to the top marginal rate, which really bites for low-income households. So if you sort of take that story together on the living wage, think of that previous chart, as everything else becomes more expensive, your housing, your healthcare, et cetera, and you are having to earn more to get to that living wage before you think about taxes. The farther you have to go, you're having to pay taxes along the way as well, right? So it's sort of you're extending and sort of forcing people to find some way up to $93,000, but then at that living wage, you are also sort of now exposed to in a relative sense, a relatively high tax environment. So again, a challenge is something that public policy needs to pay attention to. This chart gives you a sense of, for these 2 adults and 2 children that we're talking about in MIT, what share of households of different races and ethnicities with that characteristics get that 94,000, right? So we just looked at the census data and said, you've got about 2/3 of white households with that characteristic get up to that $94,000 per year income level. But between 1/4 and 1/3 of Latinx, Hispanic, Black households in that space. So it's and MIT has other comparisons as well, sort of looking at occupations and saying, for every different occupation, despite the fact Seattle is a little bit more expensive, occupations pay better, sort of one after another up in Seattle. Again, a challenging place to live. And this is a chart that I referred to at the very beginning, where the long bar is the teal colored bar, I guess, is the unadjusted median household income in 2020. And then with the sort of goldenrod color, we're adjusting it for inflation. We've sorted these off of those goldenrod bars, and there you can sort of see Seattle, you get a median household income 95, but you adjust it back to 83 because it's so expensive to live there. You're still better off than Austin, Salt Lake, Nashville, et cetera. You get down to Portland, you're taking a $77,000 median household income, you have to adjust it back for a higher than average U.S. cost of living, down to almost $73,000. So I think that brings us to 5 takeaways. First takeaway, the economy's ability to adapt to social distancing together with massive federal interventions resulted in the shortest recession in U.S. history. I would just sort of step back and say, if somebody had told us in May of 2020 or June of 2020 that we would be sitting here in the condition that we're sitting here with an economy, you would say, hey, I can't remember any projection back in May of 2020 or June of 2020 that we're going to have us at unemployment rate of 4. And people generally as well off, even though better off than we are. So a pretty remarkable bit of human adjustment and massive federal intervention. Portland region has among the best health outcomes, public health outcomes in the country, and that consumer behavior and government regulation is partially responsible for those outcomes. But that, in turn, has come at a cost and has slowed the job recovery relative to our peers. All U.S. downtowns share a long-term challenge of recovering from a shift to remote work. But our comparisons with Seattle suggest the recovery of downtown Portland faces additional challenges, likely related to concerns about safety. That's outside of my jurisdiction. That's more of a DHM poll. But I think that we certainly are finding that in DHM. People vote with their feet. And during the mid-2010s, a lot of people were voting for Greater Portland. That's much less the case recently, which could spell trouble in the coming era of slow U.S. population growth. So I think Oregon and Portland have always had some ambivalence about growth. Oh, it's in our DNA. This is not Houston. This is not Atlanta. This is not Dallas-Fort Worth with this sort of go, 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 go. We're going to have to step back, and we're not going to become them, but we're going to have a different mindset because the demography in front of us is different, and that's going to have to sink in, or we'll be in trouble. And the Portland region is an expensive place to live relative to most of our peer regions. The high cost of housing, driven by chronic underproduction, is the main culprit. State and local taxation adds to the affordability challenge. So, until, especially we get that housing production moving in ways that we occasionally saw in the 70s and 90s, we expect the same grumpy responses to the DHM surveys until we get that policy right. So with that, Andrew, I think we're going to pause here and have a conversation.
Absolutely. Good job. Big round of applause. Have to turn this on.
Look at that. There we have it. Okay, well, we don't have a fire, so this is not actually a fireside chat. Well, we said it was a fireside chat in my notes here. So thanks for obviously this presentation. And obviously we started out this day in this beautiful room, and it was a little cloudy out. Let's see if I can project. Can all of you hear me without this microphone? Great. So I'm going to avoid the reverberation. So we started out with a cloudy morning. It was a little gloomy. Now the sun is out, so the economy has clearly turned the corner as a result of this presentation. Thank you very much, Karen. So I think there's some things I want to add a little bit here, especially towards the end, because it's fascinating for us in the business community have been driving the point home about affordability, cost of living, housing production, taxes, things that are in some ways controllable. Right? And the decisions we make around those are somewhat controllable. There was a poll released, not by the Portland Business Alliance 2 months ago. It was commissioned by the Fire Bureau. And if you didn't see the results of that poll, they're widely available now, but it demonstrated something that I thought was fascinating for the first time. Portland only residents were asked the question, do you want to increase your property taxes to pay for important fire services? And resoundingly, they said no. And so I think what we're seeing is a disruption of what we assumed to be the case of Portland, right? That they assumed they would want a tax increase, or they assumed a different approach to the way the government services are delivered. And so we're seeing this pivot. And I'm going to go back and just think broadly this business community. Go back to 2020. I know there's a lot of people on different sides of the fence around the transportation measure, but it was the first time in this region where voters, 3 county voters, said no to a measure. It's a pivot in mentality and paradigm that's important for the conversation we're having about cost of living. How expensive is it here? And what are the important choices? How do we sort and prioritize the things that we're spending on? And obviously, Portlanders are resoundingly saying we care about the priorities around homelessness and housing, and we want to focus on those issues. And that's a pivot. And I want to just call that out because some of the data you saw there in the cost of living analysis that John presented, that's 2019 data. So all of you recognize that as of January, you were probably, or many of your employees were starting to pay for 2 new measures, both the preschool for all Multnomah County income tax, as well as the supportive housing services measure as well. So we are now in a 4 income tax locality where we are sitting right now. And so the implications of that graph, we'll come back and look at this in a couple of years, will be significant. But I want to pivot into just actual conversation here, just ask you some questions. And I want to focus on the human element of this too, because I know there are Portlanders and even some in this room that are probably thinking, oh, good. Those out-of-staters stopped moving here. Those Californians, those New Yorkers, people are stopping having kids. Hooray. We no longer have these drivers of the friction that creates housing increases in cost of living for housing, right? For rent, for home ownership. And I just wanted to claim that my wife and I checked 2 boxes. We moved here from New York and we've had 3 children. So we're both on net in-migration and household increase in size. So we're guilty of increasing the cost of living here by purely existing. So tell me, we're seeing this historic and significant growth that we've had really over several decades turn negative here in Multnomah County, with the exception of Clark County. Is that a good thing? To answer the question of what's in Portlanders' minds about hooray, people aren't coming.
No, we have an example for that. You can call it Cleveland or St. Louis or Cincinnati. I went on a best practice trip with Randy Miller to Cleveland 8 or 9 years ago, and they, comparably sized metro areas were moving in the opposite direction. And I remember sitting and listening to an economic development official there say, part of their economic development strategy was to get on a plane and fly to New York City and fly to Boston and fly to Washington, D.C. and try to persuade people who had grown up in Cleveland to move back. So there was sort of a refreshing of ideas and dynamic growth. Wow. That is quite a place to be in. So no, a region is a living organism, almost like a cell. And if it stops growing, it stagnates and suffers. And I think all you have to do is look at many places in the West and sort of see what the consequences of that would be. And so that's my first point. No, that is a bad thing. The second piece I would make, point I would make is that the one that I ended with is that we as Portlanders and we as Oregonians really need to begin to understand that we're different at times. International immigration is down, fertility rates are down, population growth is slow. If I had to worry about 1 or 2 things, robots going to take over jobs, or are there not enough people to do jobs? I'm worried about the market far more than I'm worried about the robots taking all the jobs. And then I think one more piece to add to this is diversity. I want to live in a community that is richly diverse by race and ethnicity and by international origin. And you stop growing and we're stuck where we are. And it's just not as interesting or a dynamic place as
Yeah, and I think one of the good details that was teased out there is the moniker, the whitest city in the nation, no longer holds true. And that is largely due to our in-migration. That's a positive for the resiliency of our community, as well as obviously for our economy and for all of our businesses. So there is that positive note. So let's keep an eye on that. And let's focus now into the downtown conversation. Here we are, we're sitting in downtown. It looks splendid. We can all sit around here and celebrate it. And everyone knows, obviously, the Alliance is affiliated with the incredible 213 block downtown enhanced service district, downtown Portland Clean and Safe. We know this is the commercial center and heartbeat of the state economy. Let's just call it what it is. I'm just going to say it. It's also the crown jewel of our retail scene. And a thriving central city is key to our regional recovery. And we have a lot of data points that reveal some of the challenging news. I mean, we pointed out there the office vacancy rate. Let's start with that. The foot traffic, the visitors, the office workers, all well below our peers. So let's look a little bit deeper into this. What does the data tell you about whether this is pandemic related versus what is caused by the broadly connotated reputational damage, the public safety or other challenges? How do you say that's one bucket, pandemic, and here's everything else? What does the data tell you?
Well, that placer data that we reported was our first attempt to try to understand whether things are different here. And I would imagine there's going to be all kinds of great economic academic studies that will come out after this that will not only look at Portland, but look at every other downtown recovery and start to pick apart pieces. But the fact that you do see relative to Seattle, we chose Seattle because we felt like it was a control to some extent, sort of honestly similar climate, and they too have challenges with public safety. They've got challenges with unsheltered homelessness in their core, et cetera. So how are we looking compared to them? It begins to tell a story that there is something in it. Pandemic, remote work challenges here that you're not seeing elsewhere. And I would imagine if we were to go draw the clean and whatever the equivalent of the clean and safe boundary is in Minneapolis, Austin, and Salt Lake City, those comparisons would even be more severe.
I've been informed that I can use the microphone now. I'm trusting. Does it sound good, tech guy? Give me the thumbs up. All right. Always trust a tech guy. So let's drill into that, because you published a great, probably don't bet against Portland, right? And you pointed to something, and my office looks directly down at it, but it's the Justice Center. And you said that when that fence comes down around the Justice Center is when we can point to the reopening of downtown. Well, that fence is not down yet. So I check, on a daily basis. So it's still up there. So what will it take? Where do we see the pivot point? Where are we in relationship to that fence and that mentality of reopening our downtown core?
Yeah, no, I mean, last year we did a presentation to Prosper Portland, and I actually gave 3 indicators that were sort of milestones of recovery. One was reopening of the schools. Check. It's bumpy, but there they are. The second was people would start going to big events, sporting events. Check. We've done that. And the third was these fences come down. Not only at Justice Center, but at Apple. It really is. You can't walk through downtown and see those fences and think we are on a sustainable positive path. We clearly, it is sending a signal that we aren't running downtown to some extent. So what to do about that is a challenge. I would say one thing that I thought about a year ago is, and we could use some significant federal help, because I would say the federal government is in no small part responsible for having elevated the activity in July of 2020. I would turn to the Department of Homeland Security. I would turn to the Biden administration. I'd turn to our congressional delegation and say, this was caused in no small part. If that had not happened, yeah, we probably would have. I think the downtown protests would have tapered off. They were in the process of tapering off. So I would try to get some help from the federal government. That is one. The other thing that has come to mind is I think of the fine that we levied against the teenager from Vancouver who threw a firecracker into Eagle Creek. $36 million fine for throwing a firecracker into Eagle Creek. There are economic damages of downtown that have been incurred by any number of downtown retailers and others that extend way beyond the cost of broken glass, right? And so, if there are some, and I'm saying legitimate sort of anti-government rioters, not social justice protesters, but if there were some high-profile cases of the most egregious forms of anarchy and destruction, I would extend an attempt to get some economic damages and make a high-profile case or two out of that. And if they're minors, I would extend the damages to their parents.
Incredibly thoughtful recommendation, especially considering, we just, like you said, it isn't just the cost of staff vandalism. And I just have to give a moment. It was great reading in the Portland Business Journal on a survey that was conducted around how many businesses had suffered that vandalism. Something like 63%. This is citywide. And that kind of number, valid, you can point it all, pick apart studies at any point in time, but that kind of information is disturbing. And yes, that is maybe more of the general state of affairs. We're pointing back to these widespread destructive moments. It's a really interesting call out because we know just insurability has become a challenge for retailers who are not living on high margins. And so anything that bears out a cost, such as the inability to insure your own business for theft, vandalism, destruction, it's something that's hard to calculate in a single year, but bears out over the course of a long arc. And so I really appreciate that. And that's the sort of thinking I think we all need to pivot to, and our leaders in government need to start thinking. So I want to double down and then pivot over to our audience questions, both virtually as well as in the room. I'm going to go back to this cost of living thing because for anyone who's come here or grew up here, right, this is one of the hallmarks. This is an affordable place to live with a good quality of life, right? I mean, those are selling points. That is what you would say. That if I'm Greater Portland Inc. out there recruiting incredible businesses to come to our region or expand, or if you're a major employer trying to attract talent, you say we have good cost of living and it's a good quality of life. So we know that that's changing. So talk us through things of housing, taxes, and childcare. I certainly attest to all three of those, especially with the childcare piece. Our driving factors, what clues can we read into through the data regarding the fixes, right? How do we, and you talked about a really interesting, right? Practically talking about quotas on housing production, which is new, supply side focus, regarding the fixes to these main drivers of our affordability crisis. How do we claw it back?
Yeah, so again, I would urge everybody to keep their eyes over the course of this year on this emerging legislation. Right now, it's housed, the work is being done at DLCD in collaboration with Oregon Housing and Community Services, et cetera. So for those of you who aren't deep policy wonks, House Bill 2003 was passed in 2019. It looked for the creation of a new sort of academic exercise to come up with a 20-year projection of housing need. Basically said that the state as a whole needs to build roughly 30,000 units a year for 20 years. That's way more than we have been building. So this piece of legislation does that just become, is that just going to sit there as an academic exercise, or are we going to use it in some way? And the using it in some way is we put these needs projections out there at a geographic space, and then from the state level, use some combination of carrots and sticks to compel localities to produce those units. And it goes against the headwinds of every neighborhood in this state that doesn't want the housing to be built there. And it goes against the cultures of many local bureaus who are more about sort of their missions are different. It's about design and care, et cetera. It's not about an imperative of unit production. So you're working against culture, you're working against ingrained NIMBYism, and you're working against, I think, just an overall general DNA ambivalence about growth that I think has created a humanitarian crisis in the state. So, but the theory of action is if you put more power at the state level, it's farther away from all that local noise, and you press forward with more state intention there. So that's that's housing. On taxes, I would say that if Portland were a region where a congressperson, and we do have a congressperson, it would be in the progressive caucus of the House. It is in the progressive caucus of the House. And this region's, in essence, what it's done over the course of the last 3 years is basically said, we're tired with the federal government to produce universal pre-K. We're tired of waiting for the federal government to help us with our homelessness crisis. So we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to press it. We're going to press ahead. And I will admit that I voted for most of these taxes, and I know the PBA supported most of these taxes as well. But there's a challenge for a small region that is relatively easy to leave, forging way ahead of sort of the federal construct. And so, selfishly, from a Portlander's perspective, if this region's intention is to deliver sort of services more like the Progressive Caucus, you do need the federal government to start to move a little bit in that direction. So we're not trying to fill in quite as many gaps as the aspirations So that's the tax front. On childcare, I would say very briefly, I started my career at the Congressional Budget Office on Clinton's welfare reform. And in the late 1980s, there was a mindset change that basically said, we are not expecting parents to stay home with their kids. That especially single parents, they have a responsibility to work. And that was a shift in the late 1980s. It then led to Clinton's welfare reform and time-limited welfare, et cetera. We never made a corresponding investment in childcare subsidies. So in essence, you shifted social policy and expected specifically single mothers to work without any kind of commensurate support. And at this point, because of the inflation, for a very labor-intensive activity that is not easy to reduce the cost through technology, you just have impossible budget situations for play with that living wage calculator for a single mother with 2 kids. I had 2 adults in there. That's an easier budget. Play around with a single mother with 2 kids, and it's impossible budget.
All right, sobering stuff. Now let's switch to the audience questions. They're actually really good ones, and I'll shout you out. I'm going to start with our friends in the virtual world. Will Furwith, with longtime colleague at Willamette University, asked a great question. What did Clark County do? How are they the fastest growing county? Where did they get all that swagger from? I'm sorry, well, I'm not using your exact words, but what's up with Clark County and all the people?
What's up with that? I think first of all, I think some of it is attitude and vision. I think when you go on that side of the border, there is a little bit more of a pro-growth mentality. And I think they've done a great job in seeing it in suburbs here as well. So looking into Portland and saying, oh, okay, Portland's got these interesting sort of home-built, person-made amenities, restaurants, and those kinds of things. Let's just have some branches over here at the same places so that people can go to Little Conejo and have a really good taco, or they've got breweries over there as well. So they, it is this is a fascinating region in that you've got this juxtaposition of three counties and this one county on the side with very different tax systems. And there is no difference like that anywhere else in the United States. And yet, then you also have access to all the same natural amenities. You get to Oklahoma Falls and get to the coast, et cetera. So it does set up just an interesting economic experiment when you sort of change the tax and service structure as much as you had within a region that has so much difference. I would also say, take a look at the schools. The reputations of schools on that side have been higher, dating back to the early 2000s when we had big, huge funding challenges. But then they also passed the Cleary settlement on that side, which is increased spending per student over there. So whether or not I believe that there, really is that much of a difference, I think reputationally, families might look at the banker side. It would be interesting to talk to real estate agents and get their perspectives on that as well.
And that makes you happy, Will. So I want to encourage folks that are in the room to raise your hand as well. John Russell, sort of market. How are you doing, John?
Good. As you know, I love it when I remove it.
That's a really good comment.
Is that all you want to say?
Nothing before the but is relevant.
I think you're missing a really important component of downtown vitality, which is employers. Now, my company's been working full time in the office full time because of the nature.
Yeah.
What about your own companies? What about the city of Portland? The city of Portland has hired its own workers. And I think until employers get rid of the laissez-faire, you can do it all you want, we're going to be stuck with
No, you're spot on, John. And we did put that, we did do a piece for Prosper a year ago and made that point that you've got all kinds of, and this sort of goes back to the heart attack story. You need to be thinking about all these different pieces. And for example, I know of a major employer down here who was sort of quasi-public, who just decided they're going to have an awful lot of remote. Well, did anybody from City Hall go and approach them and try to persuade them that, let's try to balance out the cost benefits and the need for you to come downtown? So no, we need to be much more active in and not just being neutral to employers and saying go figure it out on your own. Let's try to figure out how to make this attractive and work employer by employer to get people downtown. You're absolutely right.
What about your own business?
We are ECONorthwest. Once Omicron is clear, is aspiring to a Tuesday through Thursday in the office.
Yeah, and for us, John, I joked about this with my team, but when I sent out our last return to work policy, it was the same day the New York Times ran a headline which said Frankenstein variant discovered in South Africa. And so, similarly, we're predicating our return to work on March 31st. It's a 3-day-a-week hybrid option, and across the organization, quite differing experiences within departments. But that's when we're benchmarking it. But similarly, the flexibility as an employer, you can't ignore that part of it either. So there are such conflicting pieces here. But then again, who would have thought we would have been here 2 years deep into a public health driven virtual experience? So great question, but I know it's going to vary
almost uniformly across industries. I'm going to pivot to, and just so audience knows what John was asking for the virtual speakers, he's asking what about the employer base, the actual tenants in downtown, and what are they doing? So that's what the derivative of that question was. I got to tell you what's going on with you. What's your question?
So my question is about if you were to look at sort of the bottom 20% of income distribution and the top 20%, I think you'd have a very different view of both the recession and the recovery. And could you just talk about that and what impact that's going to have on policies, on people's sense of whether there is a recovery at all, and just what the impact is going to be for that, because I think it's a very different picture.
It is a very, very different picture. So we came into this recession with deep income inequality that just was exacerbated in very dramatic ways. And you had a recession that was centered at the low end of the wage in ways that past recessions hadn't been. Right? If you looked at the Great Recession, it hit a lot in the middle and housing construction and the like, and then indirectly it hit the restaurants and hospitality. And if you look at the recession before that, it was tech, sort of high and middle, that indirectly then hit the restaurants, et cetera. This just squarely hit the low end. And fortunately, the federal government came in to support that aggressively. And so staying on the low end story, there is some hope. The strongest wage pressure right now is at the low end. So you're starting to see some gains, and there's some opportunity there. Have to do everything. I will do a shout out for the governor's future ready workforce development bill that's sort of moving its way through. She's asking for $200 billion to allow dislocated workers who don't have post-secondary experience to have just a surge of training opportunities over the course of the next couple of years. I think it would be one of the best, most coherent uses of American Rescue Plan dollars anywhere in the United States that passes the legislature. So keep your eye on that. That's that story. On the high end, it just sort of got blown away. Many people didn't lose income. They just kept going about their ways. Many small business owners got PPP loans that weren't necessarily needed to the extent for their original purpose. And then anybody who has held stock and assets in the market or housing, all of that has appreciated. So when the dust is settled, 3-4 years from now, when we look back, I think you are going to see huge increases in wealth gaps. That it's just absolutely the wrong direction. So it really just redoubles the urgency to think about how we help those who don't have wealth.
Well, this is a great way and a great last question to sort of take us home here. I'm going to thank Keen Banzer Losberg, who asked this question virtually. So based on current data and economic policies, what do the next 3 years look like for Portland? You may bring out your crystal ball.
You remember how well it worked in 2020. Oh boy, what does it look like for Portland? Well, so and now I'm going to speak to the region, and I will say, let's get out there and think about that opportunity with Intel and that industry. We've got a semiconductor task force that Senator White and Governor Brown and Maria Pope at PGE have convened. This is the global center for semiconductor development and design. And we don't take credit for it. We don't honor it. It's a tremendous opportunity. We are not going to be in the game of 1,000-acre parcels and eight production fabs, but we can be in the game of aiding and abetting the expanding that sector that is already here and is already very strong. So having Intel's CEO at the business summit in December was a great first step. Having Senator Wyden, the governor, and PGE involved in this, and the list is long. I think it's absolutely critical. That's very important. I would say then that the rest of it has to do with making the best of this opportunity now. I would go back to the governor's workforce proposal. The state has long looked at these very ambitious 40-40-20 educational attainment plans or adult workforce goals. We need to train 300,000 adult workers. If ever there was a time, you've got, labor force participation rate is low, and low among an awful lot of people who have time, and you've got this incredible injection that is not going to happen again, a federal resource. We have so much opportunity if we align it well and steady it well over the course of the next 2 or 3 years to just come out of the gates strong. And again, I would say, sort of stepping back and looking at the region, I'm hopeful. My bet is still on Portland, as our late founder Ed Whitelaw would say. He told me shortly before he died, he said, "John, is Mount Hood still outside and the blocks are short downtown?" I said, "Yes, Ed." He says, "It's going to work."
That's the most refreshing comment I've heard in a while. I couldn't agree more. Please give John Tapogna.
The fundamentals are still strong, and this region is incredible. Our business community is resilient. I want to thank everyone for being an employer here in this room, and to be hopeful for a brighter future for this region. I want to thank the incredible team, Katie, Vanessa, Shay, Becca, Mikola, who's out front here, just for serving your community, your business community. Please give the staff of the Portland Business Alliance a huge round of applause. Our incredible sponsors that made this event possible, to the board members here. Gratitude to all of you, to those in the virtual audience. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to more in-person experiences in the future. Everyone stay healthy, take care, be well, and have a great day. Bye.